I want to talk a little bit about analysis and about how you go about coming to an understanding of what is going on in a literary text. This, as I said in other places, is a process that requires multiple passes through. You cannot simply do one reading, but you have to do multiple readings and work your way through. However, that said, I want to provide you with some highlights of a method or a protocol that you can follow that should loosen up some ideas for you and open up the text. So some of this you've seen before, some is new, but you have to begin always with what is being said in the text. What is it about? Start with the topic. What are the facts under discussion? Move to argument or theme, that is to say, what is this text trying to persuade me about? And how all of these ideas in the work of literature work collaboratively to convey meaning, to persuade you, to show you how a particular argument is going to unfold. Another very useful tip is to pay attention to the title. And the title gives you a pretty good sense of where you should be going in the piece. And if you lose your way, you always have to go back to the title for orientation. By the way, the same applies when you are writing your own essays. Your title has to be like a lodestar, the North Star by which navigators used to sail around the oceans. It's got to be your orientation, your lockdown point. So, you know about highlighting the key words. You can also use TagCrowd to do this. That will help you identify the topic. I always suggest you write down your own keywords as well in the margin. In essence, this becomes, if you're writing a paper, this becomes your quotes, and this becomes your paraphrase. And when you're writing, as I'll show you in a minute, it's very useful to combine both quotes and paraphrase as you work your way through your paper and through an argument. One of the tools you can also use to help unlock meaning is the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. That's because when you analyze a text, I don't want you to take a reductionist approach. Now, a reductionist approach seeks to reduce the paper to one single meaning, or reduce that literary text to one single meaning. That isn't what you want, because it's going to oversimplify things. What you really want to do is open up the text to a range of multiple meanings. And I want to be very clear when I explain this to you, that a literary text has always multiple meanings on multiple layers. Some interpretations of a text work better than others. So it's not like you can just say anything you want, and it isn't like you can just say whatever you want as long as it's in the text. There are minor points in the text, every text, and there are major points in every text. And there are secondary issues that are supplemental and are not critical to the main argument or the main topic, and other parts of it that are essential. So the OED will certainly help you generate words. One of the passages I'm going to talk about shortly is from Sir Philip Sidney's Defense of Poetry. And he actually does OED work in his argument. In fact, he goes back and looks at the etymology of words in Greek and in ancient Latin from Rome, and shows how the meaning of those words, the etymology of those words in the original language, actually helps us understand how things work. So one exercise you can certainly do in your analysis and one of your passes through, one of your readings of the passage, is to start looking up words. And in a lot of cases, you may find that the word doesn't mean anything except what you predicted. It's not a waste of time. At least you know that there are no other hidden meanings beyond that. But be diligent and don't worry about spending too much time doing this. Sometimes you have to kiss a frog and it stays a frog. It's the cost of doing business. So start looking up words. that will generate more ideas and help you clarify what the argument is and what the topic is. Another thing you can look for in any literary text is the movement. Now, the movement is very, very important. It's different from structure. Structure identifies the most important, second most important, third most important point in a literary text. And structure has nothing to do with sequence. Structure has to do with importance. And so sometimes you can have the most important points at the end, or the middle, or the beginning, or anywhere in between. Movement is how the thing progresses. And so the simplest way is to really start with the beginning and the end, but there may be more nuanced things going on where you have to look at intermediate stages as well. If, for example, we're talking about a short story and you've got a character in that short story, one of the things you want to ask yourself is, who is this character at the beginning of the story and who are they at the end? If they have evolved into something, if the character starts off as one thing and ends up as something else, that movement is linear. If you're reading a text that has an argument and it progresses from A to B to C to D to E, that is a linear sequencing. Sometimes a literary text can be circular. That is, it ends where it starts. And so there's a kind of return to the beginning at the end of the story or whatever the text happens to be. Iterative means repetitive. So sometimes the movement of a story is repetitive. That is to say, you get not just literal repetitions, but I'm just going to put another word in here that will help you. A literal repetition is pretty easy to identify, but a tautology is actually a little harder to identify. A tautology is a repetition that doesn't use the same words, so it doesn't look like a repetition. So I could say, the glass is half empty, the cup is partially full. I'm basically saying the same kind of thing, but I'm using different words. And so a tautology is a very nuanced or subtle way of repeating things. And so some texts tend to repeat themselves once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, however. You can have a text that is both iterative and incremental, which means that the progress of the story or the argument is, I'm just going to put it in here, is kind of sequential. So you start with A, go to B, you go to C, you go to D, and then you go back to B. And to C. And you get the idea. So it's repeating, but each time it repeats, let me finish this up here. Come on. So I want you to see that this is now iterative and incremental. It goes A, B, C, D, and then it goes, so that's the first iteration. Then it goes B, C, D, E, F, G. So it is repetitive, yes, but it is also incremental because on the second time we've added E, F, and G. And so this is a movement that is both iterative and incremental. Anyways, a lot of times the movement of a passage or a text will help either reinforce the argument or undermine the argument. And here is the key point that I want to get to. And so I'm just going to put this right in caps here. All right. All of these devices and stylistic descriptors can only do one of a couple of things. Can only A, advance, enhance, support the main argument, or undermine deconstruct, challenge the main argument. So as you try to connect all of these factors to what's happening in the text, keep in mind that they're either going to be supporting the argument in the service of the argument or undermining it. Literary devices and tropes we've already talked about. What are they? What do they do? How are they being used? Of course, you want to watch for all of that. Language and style we've talked about. Readability we've talked about. What does the style have to do with the theme? Well, the style is either going to reinforce the theme or undermine and contradict the theme. It can only do two things. Now, I just want to add a couple of things here. Of course, we always want to be aware of the text and the subtext of the passage. And the subtext actually can do basically what stylistics and literary devices do. That is to say, the subtext can either enforce, enhance, repeat the argument, or the subtext can undermine, deconstruct, or challenge the argument. If it starts to challenge the main argument, remember, it becomes a countertext, which is a special kind of subtext. Another good question to ask is there a particular literary approach that's better or worse for analyzing your particular text? Boy, my typing is really bad, isn't it? So, for example, if you're looking at a Charles Dickens novel where he's critiquing industrial London and industrial capitalism, of course a Marxist approach is going to lend itself quite well. If you're doing a text that has a psychological component to it, maybe a Freudian, Jungian, Lacanian approach might be the right one to do. The last point I want to make in analysis is that you have to show textual evidence to support your claim. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm just going to show you. I've got a passage here from Sidney, and we start with the title. The title is called The Defense of Poetry, which basically means that this implies that this text is a response to an attack against poetry, where Sidney feels that he has to defend this particular form of English literature. So I just have picture here I want to show you. Okay, so here's Sidney, and he says, poetry therefore is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle terms it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. So I'll just copy this over into Word, and I want to model for you how you would start writing this or about this. So there's Sidney, and you're writing your paper, and you look at this passage and you say, okay, what Sidney is doing here is defining poetry as imitation. So you can see that he's defining imitation in a number of ways: representing, counterfeiting, and figuring forth. So he's actually said it 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways. So if I were to start talking about this, I would say, Sidney, something like this. Sidney, come on. Suggests poetry is defined as copying, and this is my paraphrase, copying, he says it is imitation, representing, counterfeiting, and figuring forth. So now I have my word, this is a paraphrase, and I've just quoted the words, keywords only. This is absolutely essential that you understand this. When you quote, I want you to quote often and short, single words or short phrases, but don't quote the whole sentence. You don't need it. So I didn't put all of this in quotation marks. I went in, that's a shotgun approach. I went in with a laser and I just took out key single words. One codicil to this whole discussion. I am always struck by this little phrase that Sidney uses here. He calls poetry a speaking picture. And the first time I read that, I thought, wow, this speaking picture, in our world today, we would call that a movie. It's fantastic that he would think of poetry as a movie. If I wanted to make that case, here's how I would do it. I always have to start with the text. Sydney calls poetry speaking picture, which, to my mind, invokes our modern day movies. So I have a quote and I have a paraphrase. And I have shown you where it says it in the text, and I've made my paraphrase here. In the name of transparency, I might want to add one other sentence to make sure that my reader is perfectly clear what I'm talking about. So you could say something like, the early movies of the 20th century were called talkies. And so the connection seems even more obvious. So make sure you anchor your claims in the text and make sure you paraphrase and explain how you arrived at your interpretation. These are some of the key points of analysis.